we win the whole thing. It's one reason why the numbers show me beating Donald Trump by 8 points here in New Hampshire, which we all know is a swing state. So Donald Trump diagnosed some of the problems correctly, but his solutions were garbage and nonsense. What were his solutions? And you said it, sir. What did you say?
Build a wall.
We're going to build a wall. We're going to turn the clock back. We're going to bring the old jobs back. We have to do the opposite of all of these things, New Hampshire. We have to turn the clock forward. We have to accelerate our economy and society for the 21st century as quickly as possible. We have to evolve in the way we see work and value. And I am the ideal candidate for that job because the opposite of Donald Trump is an Asian man who likes math. Thank you very much, New Hampshire. Let's make America think harder. Let's let them know we can come together, we can solve the problems, we can set the country on a new path because it's not left, it's not right, it's forward. And here's where we're going to go. Thank you, New Hampshire. It's so great to be back with you, and I'd love to take some questions. Sure thing. Well, I got a question here, and I know at least two people are very active about that. How many of you all care about climate change? Yeah. Me too. And if you watched the debate from Detroit, you heard me stake out the new third position on climate change. Position number 1, we have to fight climate change. Position number 2, climate change is a hoax. And then position number 3, it's worse than you think. And that is where I am. July was the hottest month in human history. The last 4 years have been the 4 warmest years in recorded history. Greenland just came out with a study saying that their ice pack is melting at the rate projected in 2070 now, 51 years earlier. The United Nations just released a report saying that we're going to be okay if the majority of the world's population goes vegetarian immediately. The numbers on the ground show very clearly that we are late to the game in fighting climate change. So we need to go very, very big in this direction as quickly as possible. I released a 5-part plan to help get us there. A lot of it's consistent with other Democratic candidates. We have to move towards more sustainable energy sources. We do have to get the rest of the world engaged because, and this is something that Americans sometimes fall into, we're only 15% of global emissions. So even if we were to go to zero very quickly, by the math, the Earth would continue to warm. So what's happening in this other 85%? What's happening is that China is investing in renewables, but then they're going to Africa and saying, hey, great news, we've got a power plant for you. It burns coal. Would you like it? And then what does Africa say? We would love it, because Africa just wants cheap energy and it does not care about the carbon footprint. So in order to be competitive with that offer, we have to get in there and say, hey, instead of the coal burning power plant, how about some solar panels? You got a lot of sun here. How about wind? And we're going to subsidize it. We're going to make it cost competitive. We're going to make it so that this is a superior option for you by the numbers than coal. In the absence of that kind of move, our domestic efforts are not going to be enough. So number 1, move ourselves towards renewable sources of energy. Number 2, help the world do the same and try and lead a global effort. The Paris Accords are not going to be enough. I would rejoin it. But the reality is that there's not that much enforcement going on with the Paris Accords, and if we re-sign, we feel good about it, Earth continues to get warmer. Number 3, we have to not just do less of the bad, we have to do more of the good. So it's not just we pollute less, we have to try and rebuild our ecology and ecosystem. So this means planting vast tracts of trees and forest land in different parts of not just the country, but in other parts of the world. It's one of the most efficient ways to capture carbon. I mean, we all saw what happened in the Amazon rainforest. I mean, it's horrifying. We have to try and essentially rebuild a lot of these forest ecosystems. We also have to try and rebuild the ocean ecosystems. We're losing 4 to 8% of the Atlantic Ocean's biomass every year. So we have to reseed plankton and other plant life forms into the ocean if we're going to try and rebuild. I would pass a constitutional amendment saying that safeguarding the environment has to be a core responsibility of the U.S. government to make sure it stands the test of time. And then the 5th thing is I would invest tens of billions of dollars to make our communities more resilient I was just in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and there are hundreds of buildings that are now flooding regularly. And we all know how this works. The government, Portsmouth's a pretty well-off town, so they're doing great work. Like, hands off to Portsmouth. But the government's way, as we all know, is to be reactive, not proactive, right? They wait until the disaster happens, then they rebuild. There's one house that's been rebuilt 36 times, not in New Hampshire, but in, whoa, sorry about this. Where am I standing that I'm not supposed to be standing? All right, it's the Russians. They're always trying to stop the Yanggang, but they can't do it. So we have to be proactive, not reactive, and we have to invest billions of dollars up front to save us tens of billions down the road. And we all know how this works. If you invest in flood prevention or the levees or making our towns more resilient, then you end up saving a lot of money down the road. And one big way to do this is to put economic resources into our hands, because you know when there's a natural disaster, who suffers the most? Poor people. People who don't even have cars to get into to drive to safety. So by putting money into our hands, it'll actually make our communities more resilient, because people will be able to protect themselves better. So this is the 5-part plan to address climate change. It's called It's Worse Than You Think, Lower Emissions, Higher Ground. But we have to face facts that even if we did everything right, we are going to be facing this challenge for a long time, and we have to get to damage control and mitigation as well as prevention. Sir.
I'm really grateful for your 5-point plan, especially on funding for those most impacted by climate change. But one thing I didn't hear was that if we extract the oil, gas, and coal that we have permitted for right now, we kind of set ourselves on a course for the worst of the climate catastrophe. So if President, would you ban further permits for fossil fuel infrastructure?
I would ban further permits for fossil fuel infrastructure on federal land and offshore drilling. Those things I would do. The other thing I would do immediately is price in carbon emissions, because how many of you all studied economics? Sorry. Studied economics. So if you do, pollution or carbon emissions are what's called an externality, where the company pollutes and they don't pay a price, we all pay the price. So what you have to do is you have to have those operations pay the price for their emissions, and then that will end up making our energy infrastructure much more efficient very, very quickly. And the externality phenomenon, it's actually one of the main sources of problems in other aspects of American life. You can see it all over, but the environment's the most obvious and egregious. Sure, man. All right, you can take the mic. This will be fun.
Okay, sweet. Thank you. So in 2016, there was an audit done on the budget of the Department of Education under the current Secretary of the Department of Education, and it showed that there was only a reliable account for roughly 40% of the actual budget, which is $68 million currently for the Department of Education. And there are several programs and initiatives that they had that were criminally underfunded, such as the Rural Education Success Act, which only had around $170 million devoted to it. So my question is, do you have, thank you, do you have a reliable, or do you have a deliberate sort of how you're going to reallocate a lot of the funds in the Department of Education now to aid a lot of the places around here, other places that are not benefiting, such as like low-income schools?
Such a detailed question. Let's give him a round of applause. There it is. It's a young man poring over the DOE budget. When I was his age, I was, not poring over the DOE budget. When it comes to K through 12 education, there are some big shifts I would be championing. So the biggest one, so on the teacher side, first, teachers are worth their weight in gold by the numbers. We should be paying teachers more. That was very obvious by the numbers. Number 2, we should decrease our emphasis on standardized tests and teaching to the tests and let teachers do their jobs. Thank you. I'm going to do a little bit of origin of the SAT. Did you know that we devised the SAT during World War II to figure out which kids not to send to the front lines? Yep. And now we're using it every year, like every year is wartime. It's like a bludgeon to many of our young people. And one of my sons is autistic and neurologically atypical, and there are kids around the country that are getting their ambitions crushed at a very young age because they're not good at these tests. They think that their potential is limited, And I call bullshit on that. I mean, that's that's what we talk about. I mean, we have to modify our education system not to be essentially like a factory or industrialized system that's like spitting out people to work on assembly lines. Like, we have to try and humanize our educational system, and the fastest way to do it is pay teachers more and not teach the test so much. The bigger picture is that 65 to 70% of K through 12 educational outcomes are based on non-school factors. That's parental time with a child, words read to them, stress levels in the house, type of neighborhood. And we all know this instinctively. Educators know this. Educators know that we are holding them 100% accountable for kids' performance, and they can only control about a third. You know, and then we get frustrated when we're like, why can't you make magic? You know, it's like, we put some more money into your school. We're probably not going to pay you more, teacher. Like, we'll probably get a consultant. Like, you know, and so the obvious measures are pay the teachers more, let them do their jobs, and then put more money into the household so the kids have a real chance to learn, and give our teachers a chance to teach. So this goes particularly far in rural areas. This goes particularly far in rural areas because, you know, like, everything in the society now revolves around the almighty dollar. So the school district starts losing money, then what does it do? Cut services, cuts corners, starts letting people go and whatnot, and then you end up in this, this negative spiral. And that's what we have to avoid in schools around the country, because it's not serving our kids at all. All right, so last one, I suppose. I'm partial to people wearing a Yang 2020 shirt. I'm a human being. I'm sorry.
What is your plan to help veterans suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder?
Are you a veteran yourself? No? I released a plan. We have to do more for our veterans. I released a plan called More Than a Handshake that's meant to recognize that we owe our veterans much, much better. And so where PTSD is concerned, we should certainly be loosening our restrictions on therapeutic and medicinal drugs that many veterans find helpful. So one obvious one is I want to legalize marijuana nationwide and across the board. That's not just for veterans, but that's for all Americans. And I would pardon everyone who's in jail for a nonviolent marijuana-related offense. One phenomenon I've noticed that I find really odd, why is it that the only people getting presidential pardons are weird rich people? You know what I mean? You should just be pardoning total unknowns who are in jail for some marijuana-related offense that you know is not even illegal in other parts of the country. Like, I want to pardon people like that. You know, I don't want to pardon someone that, like, some senator is like, oh, you know, you should really pardon my rich friend. It's like, forget that. I want to pardon people who shouldn't be in jail in the first place. So this would help vets on some measures. There are also some other drugs. I actually talked to a veteran who believes that there's some other psychotropic drugs like hallucinogens that some veterans have found helpful. And I said, look, for veterans, if they find it helpful, I'm willing to loosen restrictions on more than just pot. We need to invest in mental health resources for veterans in particular. I'm going to expand this point for just a second. We have a mental health crisis in this country across the board. It's not just vets. My brother's a psychology professor, and I know we can do much, much more, but I also know that we have a real shortage of resources in many, many parts of the country. And one of the reasons why we have such a shortage of resources in parts of the country is that we make it very, very hard to become a counselor, therapist, or someone who can help people. We even make it hard to be a social worker. It's very, very strange. It's like people just want to help other people, and then we have this expensive training program for them, and then we pay them very, very little. You know, but if they wanted to become a corporate lawyer, then we'd be like, yeah, it's great. So we need to try and bolster the mental health resources that are available in our communities. And the veteran community, I talked to a vet, and he said something to me that was really affecting. He said to me, it's like, it's not just that employers aren't giving us, like, aren't favoring us. Employers are actually looking for a reason to reject us. And that really affected me, because then you're like, wow, that's the opposite of the way it should be for vets. But then when he said that, it rang true to me. Like, it made sense to me that if you're an employer, you'd be like, well, am I going to take a chance on this veteran or not? It's like, yeah, I'll just come up with some excuse not to. So we have to do what we can to ease that by providing various incentives to hire vets, and also make it easier for vets to transition into private employment by having their licenses and experience abroad or in the military transfer to the civilian world. Because I've talked to vets who are military police or in waste disposal or truck drivers, and they come back and they're like, my credentials don't matter, even though I did this work for 5 years. Or infantry, and that just strikes me as ridiculous. It's like, you did it for 5 years in the toughest setting imaginable. Like, we should be freaking stamping that license saying, hey, guess what? It's good when you come home too. So those are some of the things in my More Than a Handshake plan, but thank you for asking about veterans, because I love veterans. Let's do more. Oh my gosh, thank you, New Hampshire. Oh my God, make history together in 2020. Thank you, you're all the best. I'm going to stick around for as long as it takes to take pictures and meet you all. So that's really what it is. There's a balancing act between taking questions and selfies, and now we're going to choose selfies. So thank you all.